Well, good evening, everybody. Can y'all hear me? Okay, well, so glad you all could make it for this public lecture sponsored by our History, Philosophy, Religion, Gender and Sexuality Studies Department with help from the Leadership Studies Department, our guest lecturer. And this is Randall Balmer. Randall taught at several universities, most recently at Dartmouth College. He's also taught at Barnard and Columbia University. He is author of over a dozen books, and some of them include this book, Solemn Reverence, The Separation of Church and State in American Life, and this book, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. And he's written also, most recent book is Passion Plays, How Religion Shaped Sports in North America. And he's written a book called Protestantism in America with Lauren Winner. And that is a book that my students are reading an excerpt from this semester. And he also wrote a textbook with two other authors, Religion in American Life. And that's also a book that my students are reading from. And so I've read for many years, and you all might know him because of his second book, which is called Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory, A Journey into the Evangelical Subculture in America. It's now in its 5th edition. But the first edition came out in the late 1980s, and in 1990 there was a 3-part PBS documentary on the evangelical subculture in America. And so he is very knowledgeable about evangelicalism in America and about what he's going to talk about tonight, Christian nationalism. When the PR department asked me for a quote on Christian nationalism, I said it's a term that we hear a lot in the news, and if I were to define it, I would say Christian nationalists, or that Christian nationalism is a tendency to collapse two loyalties into one. To say that you have to be a Christian to be an American, and you have to be an American to be a Christian. And that this is something that makes many Americans anxious about a religion being imposed on them, but also many Christians anxious about their religion being appropriated for political reasons. And so, with all this talk about it that's been in the news, we're very lucky to have Randy come and give us his wisdom and his experience and his research. He speaks as someone who's brought up in the evangelical tradition, and always speaks with, I guess, he's a loving critic, is how I found him to be. And he read a review of mine in the Interpretation Journal, and got in touch with me, which is the first time that ever happened. I've written a lot of book reviews, and this is the first time that an author got in touch with me and said he appreciated the review, so our conversation went on, and he agreed to come speak here. So without further ado, this is Randall Balmer to speak on Christian nationalism and constitutional crisis.
Thank you, David, and thank you to yourself and to your colleagues for the nice and warm welcome today. I've been delighted to be here at Marietta and enjoy your lovely town and get to know some of the folks here, especially the students today. I enjoyed our conversations, and I look forward to this conversation tonight. I want to apologize. I'm going to read something. I don't usually do this. I'd rather just talk about it, but I think it at least set the stage for the conversation that might follow afterwards. And this little essay was born out of my asking the question, why is it that all of a sudden people are talking about Christian nationalism? Why is it that there's a sudden surge of interest in this topic, both on the part of Christian nationalists themselves and on the part of other citizens who, many of them are concerned about the direction of this movement called Christian nationalism. So I tried to understand and to account for the various historical circumstances over the last 50 years that might explain, or at least partially explain, why this movement has become suddenly very popular. The heresy of Christian nationalism is wrong and destructive on so many levels. It's hard to know where to start. Jesus himself declared, "My kingdom is not of this world," a statement that would appear to have some bearing on the discussion about whether or not the United States is and always has been a Christian nation. We then confront the legal record. The founders, well aware of the religious factionalism that had roiled Europe and England, made it abundantly clear that they wanted to separate religion from the state. In formulating that novel configuration, which took form in the First Amendment, they drew on the words of Roger Williams, a lapsed Puritan and founder of the Baptist tradition in America. In 1644, Roger Williams argued for the separation of the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. That metaphor has become so familiar that we sometimes lose sight of its importance. And to understand it fully, we need to remember that the people in the 17th century were not members of the Sierra Club. That is to say, they did not share our romantic notions about wilderness. Wilderness for them was a place of danger, where evil lurked. So when Williams talks about shielding the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, his concern was protecting the faith from too close an association with the state. Allow me to provide an example. On July 31st, 2001, Roy Moore, Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, installed a granite monument emblazoned with the Ten Commandments in the lobby of the Judicial Building in Montgomery. Because Moore refused to allow any other religious sentiments in that space, the monument represented a clear violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And Judge Myron Thompson of the District Court for the Middle District of Alabama ordered the removal of the monument. As it happens, I was one of the expert witnesses in this case, arguing that the First Amendment and the separation of church and state was the best friend that religion has ever had. The First Amendment set up a free marketplace for religion in America. And the competition in that marketplace, where no one religion enjoys the favor of the state, has ensured a vibrant, salubrious religious culture unmatched anywhere in the world. After Judge Thompson's ruling, and as workers prepared to remove the monument, one of the protesters screamed, "Get your hands off my God." Unless I'm mistaken, one of the commandments etched into the side of that monument said something about graven images. And that was precisely Roger Williams' point about protecting the integrity of the faith from too close an association with the state, the wilderness of the world. The argument for Christian nationalism, therefore, that the United States is and always has been a Christian nation, falters on legal grounds. The First Amendment, which I consider America's best idea, prohibits the establishment of any religion. And when Patrick Henry introduced a bill designating Christianity as the favored religion in Virginia, James Madison led the charge against it, and the legislation was defeated. Those arguing for Christian nationalism conveniently neglect the Treaty of Tripoli, which reads in part, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." The treaty was negotiated toward the end of George Washington's presidency, submitted to Congress by John Adams with his endorsement, and ratified unanimously by the United States Senate on June 7, 1797. Article 11, again, reads, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." The attempt by Christian nationalists to baptize the founders as evangelical Christians would be laughable if it were not so ludicrous. Put simply, with the possible exception of Benjamin Rush, a physician, and John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian minister and president of the College of New Jersey, none of the founders would qualify for membership in churches where the heresy of Christian nationalism is now being propagated. History provides no support whatsoever for Christian nationalism. And when members of the National Reform Association approached Abraham Lincoln with their request for an amendment to designate the United States as a Christian nation, the president turned them away. But how did such mistaken ideas gain so much currency in recent years, especially among white evangelicals? Much of the blame rests on David Barton, a Republican political operative who claims to be a historian. Barton has become notorious for wrenching quotations out of context and for fabricating quotations out of whole cloth to argue that the United States is a Christian nation and that the separation of church and state was never intended by the founders. His malpractice is so egregious that his very conservative publisher, Thomas Nelson, withdrew one of his books, Jefferson Lies, from circulation in 2013. Even so, Barton continues to propagate these falsehoods through his organization, Wall Builders. And by the way, wall is not the wall of separation. It refers to Nehemiah raising the walls of the temple. Returning to the question at hand, why do these ideas have such appeal? I believe that there are 5 turning points in recent history to help to explain the surge of interest in Christian nationalism. The Immigration Act of 1965, the Green v. Connolly decision of 1971, the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, the nullification of the Fairness Doctrine, and the federal raid of the mining town of Wallace, Idaho in 1991. When Lyndon Johnson signed the Immigration Act on Liberty Island on October 3, 1965, he remarked that the bill addressed, quote, a very deep and painful flaw in the fabric of American justice. It corrects a cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation. Johnson also insisted that the bill, quote, will not reshape the structure of our daily lives. Coming on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement, the Immigration Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, eliminated the restrictive immigration quotas set in place by the Reed-Johnson Act of 1924. President Johnson was correct in saying that the legislation corrected a cruel and enduring wrong, but he was mistaken in promising that it would not reshape the structure of our daily lives. In the decades since 1965, immigrants from Asia and South Asia have reconfigured the religious landscape of North America. Hindu temples, Buddhist stupas, Muslim mosques, Sikh gurdwaras, Shinto shrines have popped up in the most unlikely places, testimony to the rich and enduring religious diversity of the United States. But not all Americans have welcomed these changes. Many white evangelicals came to regard increased religious diversity as a zero-sum game. Any increase in religious options came at the expense of evangelical Christianity. They weren't entirely wrong. Any expansion in the buffet of religious options lessens the chances that Americans would choose Christianity. Add to that the anti-institutional sentiments of the counterculture, and many white evangelicals began to suspect that the hegemonic hold they once had on American society, whether real or imagined, was slipping away. Despite their overwhelming numbers, they began to think of themselves as a minority. Second turning point, the Green v. Connolly decision of 1971 must be viewed in the historical context of the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education ruling of 1954 and the Civil Rights Act 10 years later, which forbade racial segregation in public places. The immediate context was Holmes County, Mississippi, where the number of white students in the public schools dropped from 771 to 28 during the first year of desegregation, and to 0 the following year. At the same time, 3 whites-only segregation academies applied to the Internal Revenue Service for tax-exempt status. A group of parents in Holmes County filed suit. That suit was combined with another and made its way to the District Court for the District of Columbia. On June 30th, 1971, the court ruled that, quote, racially discriminatory private schools are not entitled to the federal tax exemption provided for charitable educational institutions, and persons making gifts to such schools are not entitled to the deductions provided in case of gifts to charitable educational institutions, in effect ruling that any organization or institution that engages in racial segregation is not, by definition, a charitable institution. Because this decision was released the same day that the Supreme Court ruled that the New York Times and the Washington Post could resume publishing the Pentagon Papers, the Green v. Connolly decision has not received the notice it deserves. But you can be sure that Jerry Falwell and other evangelical leaders took notice. Falwell had started his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1967. And the other school squarely in the crosshairs of the Green v. Connolly decision was Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina. As evangelical leaders themselves have acknowledged, when the Internal Revenue Service began to enforce the Green v. Connolly ruling over the course of the 1970s, resistance to racial integration, not the Roe v. Wade abortion decision of 1973, became the catalyst for the religious right. And I'm happy to talk more about that later. The third development took place in America's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention. In March 1967, over coffee and beignet, Paul Pressler, a judge from Texas, and Paige Patterson, a student at New Orleans Theological Seminary, met at Café du Monde in New Orleans to excoriate the putative descent into liberalism in the Southern Baptist Convention. As their conversation continued into the night, they began plotting how to seize control of the denomination, a strategy that finally came to fruition in June 1979. The conservative, some say fundamentalist, takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention had enormous repercussions, both within the denomination and beyond. The Southern Baptist Convention historically had been watchmen on the wall of separation between church and state, a tradition extending back to George Washington Truett, John Leland, Isaac Backus, and Roger Williams himself. In 1960, for example, during the Kennedy-Nixon presidential campaign, W.A. Criswell, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, affirmed that great principle that is written into our country's Constitution, that church and state must be in this land forever separate and free. In 1984, however, 5 years after the conservative takeover, Criswell told CBS News, "I believe this notion of separation of church and state was the figment of some infidel's imagination." The defection of the Southern Baptist Convention as guardians of church-state separation created an opening for all sorts of mischief. And when the Southern Baptist Convention severed ties with the Baptist Joint Committee in 1991, a long-standing and powerful advocate for the separation of church and state no longer spoke for Southern Baptists. In its place, the Southern Baptist Convention established the Christian Life Commission, later renamed the Ethics and Religious Life Commission, headed by Richard Land, a reliable ally of the religious right. Under his leadership, the convention shifted away from worries about religious establishment to what Land called accommodation of religion. In 2010, he reflected on the sea change within the denomination. The majority of Southern Baptists, you give them a choice between the Joint Committee's separation and establishment, he said, and they're going to choose establishment. Land and the Southern Baptists supported an amendment to allow public prayer in public schools, as well as school vouchers for religious schools, thereby swinging open the door to Christian nationalism. The fourth pillar for the emergence of Christian nationalism was Ronald Reagan's revocation of the Fairness Doctrine. Formulated by the Federal Communications Commission in 1949 and drawing on the Radio Act of 1927, the Fairness Doctrine mandated that, quote, a basic standard of fairness guide the discussion of public affairs over the airwaves. Any individual under attack on radio or television, for example, must be offered equal time to respond to such attacks. The Fairness Doctrine was challenged before the Supreme Court by arch-fundamentalist Carl McIntyre, whose radio station in Red Lion, Pennsylvania, had aired a 15-minute attack on a journalist, Fred J. Cook, for his book criticizing Barry Goldwater. After McIntyre denied Cook's request for equal time, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously against McIntyre and in support of the Fairness Doctrine. And I'm going to take a little detour here because it's such a fascinating story. McIntyre's continued refusal to comply led to the revocation of his license, and then to one of the most amusing incidents in all of American religious history. McIntyre secured the use of a World War II-era minesweeper, outfitted it with a radio transmitter, and set sail 3 miles into the Atlantic off the coast of Cape May, New Jersey, where he began to broadcast what he called Radio Free America from international waters. After complaints that he was jamming other radio signals, the Coast Guard was dispatched to reel him in, and thereby the strange saga of Radio Free America ended after just a few hours. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist adding to that story. Despite the court's affirmation of the Fairness Doctrine, the Reagan administration took against it, joined by the emerging cable and satellite broadcasters. In 1985, the FCC decided that the Fairness Doctrine had a chilling effect on free speech. In 1987, the Commission revoked it completely, thereby abandoning a basic standard of fairness in public media and setting the stage for the unabashedly partisan landscape we see today, where outrageous ideas and conspiracy theories go unchallenged. The final pillar supporting Christian nationalism is what has come to be known as government overreach. On the morning of June 23rd, 1991, 150 federal agents raided 58 bars in Wallace, a small mining town in the panhandle of northern Idaho, an area also known as the Silver Valley. Agents seized approximately 200 video poker machines, which were considered illegal when used for gambling. Local residents protested that the largest raid in the Rocky Mountain region was unnecessary, especially in a town reeling economically with an unemployment rate of 20%. We might be hicks in the sticks, one resident told the New York Times, but we know what overkill is. A year later, federal agents engaged in a standoff at Ruby Ridge, another small community in Idaho. Sammy Weaver and his mother, Vicki, were killed in the course of an 11-day siege when federal marshals tried to arrest Randy Weaver for failure to appear in court on a weapons charge. The colony of neo-Nazis in nearby Hayden Lake took an interest, and thus was born the militia movement, which contends that the federal government illegally intrudes on the lives of private citizens. According to Bill Moreland, who covered the standoff for the Spokane Spokesman Review, Ruby Ridge became a demarcation point for the rise of the modern militia movement. Those suspicions deepened with the siege of the Branch Davidian compound outside of Waco, Texas in 1993 over reports of child abuse. 76 Davidians, including the leader, David Koresh, perished. The most notorious response to these government actions was Timothy McVeigh's bombing of the Murrah Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City. the Cliven Bundy's defiance of federal authorities in Clark County, Nevada in 2014, and his son Haman's occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon 2 years later, also built on distrust and defiance of the government. As Betsy Gaines Quammen points out in True West, Myth and Mending on the Far Side of America, these rogue actions, fueled by conspiracy theories, carry a heavy overlay of Christian nationalism. Truth is reality as God sees it, Matt Shea, one of the leaders, told a rally in St. Regis, Montana in 2021. We are gaining ground for liberty. We are taking ground for liberty. We are advancing the kingdom of Jesus Christ. I'm not prepared to argue that these 5 events over the past half century, the Immigration Act of 1965, the Green v. Connolly decision, the Southern Baptist takeover, the revocation of the Fairness Doctrine, and the government's actions in the West fully account for the rise of Christian nationalism in recent years. But each contributed in its own way. The Immigration Act admitted a diversity of believers in sufficient numbers that many Christians began to sense that their hegemonic hold on American society was slipping away. Green v. Connolly challenged white evangelicals' control over the workings of their own institutions, particularly their supposed freedom to discriminate. After 1979, fundamentalists in the Southern Baptist Convention defaulted on their guardianship of the wall of separation between church and state, even to the point of seeking taxpayer funding for religious schools. And the Supreme Court is busily chiseling away at the wall of separation. Revocation of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 allowed for the propagation of preposterous claims and conspiracy theories without response or refutation. Finally, the perceived overreach of federal agents beginning in 1991 fueled dissent and calls for a revolution to make the United States into a Christian nation. Taken together, these events, and especially the response to these events, created a witch's brew, a cauldron of dissent and agitation that threatens the future of democracy in America. Christian nationalists are unambiguous about their desire for a theocracy where same-sex relationships would be outlawed and civil and criminal codes would be rewritten in conformity to their interpretation of the Bible, including Levitical laws. According to Greg Bahnsen, part of the Christian Reconstruction movement, the civil precepts of the Old Testament are a model of perfect social justice for all cultures, even in the punishment of criminals. Christian nationalists openly pined for a time, quote, when the Bible was publicly accepted as the basis for law and society. In order to participate in the public square, according to another Christian nationalist, unbelievers would need to learn to frame appeals in a Christian framework. As Mark Massa points out in his forthcoming book about Catholic fundamentalism, white Protestants are not the only ones pressing for Christian nationalism. The problem with America is America never sat down and had the right discussion about which religion is the right religion, one such Catholic fundamentalist wrote. The only way to run a country is by benevolent dictatorship with a Catholic monarch who protects his people from themselves and bestows on them what they need, not necessarily what they want. Michael Boris, founder of the right-wing Catholic website Church Militant, said that violence must always be an option in the political arena, and praised Donald Trump's efforts to, quote, tear down the wall between church and state. The First Amendment's proscription against religious establishment would be neutered or simply ignored by Christian nationalists. One proposal, pushed by the National Reform Association in Congress since the 1870s, would amend the Constitution to read, "This nation devoutly recognizes the authority and law of Jesus Christ, Savior and ruler of nations, through whom are bestowed the blessings of Almighty God. As William Gold of the National Reform Association explains, the state, like the church, is under the mediatorial rule of Jesus Christ, and it is the duty of the state to confess its subjection to Christ. If these ideas represent a real and present danger, and I think they do, how should we respond? That is, how should people who prize democracy, including people of faith, forestall the heresy of Christian nationalism? First, we must affirm the importance of history. No, the founders were not evangelical Christians. Yes, the First Amendment unequivocally prohibits any form of religious establishment. And yes, the Treaty of Tripoli, the government of the United States, is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, represented the clear consensus of elected officials in the new nation. We can also take a lesson from previous attempts to designate the United States as a Christian nation and thank Lincoln and others for forestalling such foolishness. The First Amendment, America's best idea, has ensured religious vitality in the United States unmatched anywhere in the world. While invoking history to refute Christian nationalism, we must also come to terms with America's original sin, racism. No, slavery was not a benign institution that taught enslaved people valuable professional skills, as the state of Florida would have us believe. And white evangelicals must reckon with the fact that their political movement, the religious right, was born in defense of racial segregation in evangelical institutions. Second, we should emphasize that the battle against Christian nationalism is a patriotic enterprise. Although you probably won't find me waving flags or wearing red baseball caps, I consider myself a patriot. I'm patriotic because of my sense as a historian that, at least until recently, Americans have generally sought to live into the radical ideas enshrined in our charter documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Those documents ensure the rights of minorities and eschew majoritarianism, the notion that the majority dictates to minorities. Slowly but surely, albeit far too slowly, with regard to women and minorities, Americans nevertheless eventually rise to their better selves to ensure equality to everyone. Yes, we've seen some reversals in recent years, but I continue to have confidence in the durability of American ideals. Finally, we must reclaim and reaffirm the protocols of democracy. As Jeffrey Stout argues in Democracy and Tradition, we Americans have over 2+ centuries, have developed tools to keep this great experiment alive. We must learn once again to talk with one another and to listen. Civil discourse is essential. Yes, everyone has a voice in the arena of public discourse, but some voices are insisting these days that only theirs be heard. The important task of refuting Christian nationalism entails listening to many voices, including those of the Christian nationalists themselves, and subjecting those views to public scrutiny. When that happens, when these movements are exposed for what they are, whether the Ku Klux Klan or QAnon or Christian nationalism, they tend to be far less alluring. When you look under the hood at the origins, the motivations, and the effects, Christian nationalism is not the new, shiny thing it pretends to be. Thank you.
We're going to have some time for questions, and I have a couple of students that have microphones. So if you just raise your hand if you have a question, and they'll bring the microphone to you so you can ask it and everyone can hear it. And so we have a question over here, Pastor Carla.
Yes, you do.
Hi. I don't know if that was a slip of the tongue or not, but I am the pastor of First Congregational Church, United Church of Christ here in Marietta. And I've been doing a lot of reading over the last couple of years about a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation. But what I'm finding is either from within in very glowing terms or almost hysterical anti-treatment. Can you give a measured opinion on the relationship, if any, between the New Apostolic Reformation and Christian nationalism?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not an expert on this, I have to say. But the New Apostolic Reformation is kind of the radical fringe of this Christian nationalist movement, as far as I can understand. Yeah. And actually, I was talking about this topic earlier this week to a group of Lutheran military chaplains, and they were asking about this as well. And as I understand it, this was really begun, this whole idea of the New Apostolic Reformation, but also associated with that is something called the Seven Mountains theory. And that was devised by a man named Warren Cunningham, who was head of a missionary group called Youth with a Mission. And apparently the Seven Mountains thing was devised as a sort of kind of PR pitch, selling point. But the ideology behind it is that Christians, and again, their use of the term Christian is quite narrow, quite specific, need to take over the seven mountains of culture. And I'm not going to be able to name all the seven, maybe somebody can help me, but education is one, family, the legal system, politics.
Legal system and politics are together. Media.
There you go.
Schools.
Family.
Schools and family are separate. Okay, so all you really need to do is go to the National Day of Prayer Task Force website and read their recommended documents on how to lead a National Day of Prayer service. And they will list the seven mountains for you.
That's what this is. Yeah. And the New Apostolic Reformation is associated with that. The other person who's a leader of this is a guy named Lance Wallnau, Wallnau, and he's been out there pushing this rather vigorously. The candidate for governor of Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano, was it? 2 years ago? 2 years ago. He was very much involved in this movement, as I understand it. And by the way, one of the real resources for this whole general topic is a series of podcast episodes that have been produced by a man named Warren Throckmorton, retired professor at Grove City College in Pennsylvania, which, by the way, is a very conservative school. There's a conservative school, as you probably know. And he's put together a series of podcasts called Getting Jefferson Right. And he really goes into David Barton in some detail, but he also addresses the Seven Mountains stuff.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please. But we have.
In this world of Christian nationalism, where do people who practice Judaism in this country fit in? Will they be allowed to vote?
People who practice
Judaism?
Oh, Judaism, yeah. I don't think it's entirely clear. I'm not sure there's one answer to that. I think Jews would probably be treated as second-class citizens, probably at best. Although the extent to which they would advocate for Levitical laws, I suppose, would give them a certain standing within this new world order they're trying to bring about. But no, and I'm not trying to be funny or facetious about it. It's a very serious matter. As they envision the recasting of American society, and I think I'm not exaggerating here, I want to be careful about that. anyone who did not fit their definition of Christian, which again is a very constricted definition, would be treated at best as second-class citizens. Maybe allowed to stay in some capacity, but would not have full rights of citizens that they envision. Again, I have to specify that there's a spectrum within that movement. There's some folks who would just simply like defend commandments in public spaces and things like that. But the more radical voices, which tend to be the leaders of the movement, are quite radical on these things.
You were saying that the Christian nationalists want laws in this country to be based on their version of their version of the Bible. So would you give examples of the laws and the Supreme Court decisions that fit within their version of?
Yeah, it's a good question. The Christian Reconstructionists, which are pretty close, I think, to the New Apostolic Reformation folks, the Christian Reconstructionists envision a rewriting of the United States civil and criminal code to be in compliance with Levitical laws. So, homosexuality, for example, would be a capital offense in their rewriting of American laws. Now, you asked about the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court hasn't gone that far, certainly. And I think, for me, a decade ago, I would have kind of trusted the Supreme Court to be a break on some of these ideas, but I no longer have that confidence. Especially the First Amendment. I mean, the Espinoza decision, the May decision just recently, they have scant regard for the First Amendment and separation of church and state. And that worries me.
In the spirit of not preventing anyone from practicing their own religion, there's a movement in Ohio, and it has to do with public schools. And a group goes into public schools. There were laws written that you can worship and lead worship services off campus of public schools. Well, they're going in and recruiting students in mostly inner city schools, feeding them during their lunch hour, having popcorn parties, movies, giving them shirts to wear, and making students whose parents will not allow them to participate envious of what they're doing, and they are actually busing the students a block away in most cases to do this. Some principals have lost their jobs for promoting it in the schools, but how widespread is what's going on in Ohio across the nation?
Yeah, well, you have that, and this has been around in some form or another for a while. I used to have these, I don't know if they're still doing these rally around the flag gatherings. And the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints, they have catechism classes before the school day and so forth.
And in Ohio, the Amish have always.
Yeah, the Amish, right?
Right.
Yeah. And then you have the voucher program. I think you still have it here, right? Yeah. Actually, when that was inaugurated, I went to Cleveland and wrote about that for one of my books, Thy Kingdom Come, about how that was working. And parents have the right to send their children anywhere they want to go to school. I don't quarrel with that. But the issue is using taxpayer money for religious education. I mean, that's a bright line in the First Amendment, the separation of church and state. I think, that frankly, the larger issue for me, I'm a product of public education, public schools, and I'm very proud of it. And I think that public education is our best chance of democracy, because public schools historically, traditionally, have been one place where children from different religious backgrounds, different ethnic, racial backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, could come together and in the classroom, on the playground, explore their similarities as well as their differences and get along with them. That to me sounds like a recipe for democracy. And when you have this stratification of education, especially when it's supported by the state, by taxpayers, I think you're undermining the future, undermining democracy. Now, I'm prepared to acknowledge that public education has not always lived up to those ideals. I'm not foolish, I understand that. But it seems to me that it's an experiment well worth pursuing. And the voucher stuff here in Ohio, now Iowa's gone whole hog in that direction. In Florida, Oklahoma, these other places, I think it's ruinous. I really do. Nobody on this side? Come on. All right.
Going back to what Professor Barber was asking about with Judaism, could you speak to sort of the almost kind of the cognitive dissonance between the kind of latent or overt anti-Semitism that one would see with Christian nationalism, along with or compared to the hyper-Zionism that is also extant in Christian evangelical movement? And can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that?
Yeah, that's a big topic. But yeah, I sometimes characterize it as evangelicals being simultaneously pro-Israel and anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitic in the sense that they ultimately look for the conversion of Jews to Christianity. That's what I mean by being anti-Semitic. Yeah, it's that whole impulse, that whole movement is rooted in something called premillennialism.
We're Southern Baptist Church, so yeah.
You know about this, right? Yeah, but I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but premillennialism was very big among evangelicals for much of the 20th century. It's faded a good bit for all sorts of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about, but I'm not going to get into right now. And premillennialism is the expectation that Jesus will return at any moment to collect the faithful, that is, again, this narrow definition of Christians, and unleash judgment on everybody else. And one of the corollaries to that is that in this apocalyptic, as this apocalyptic scenario unfolds, the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem, animal sacrifice will resume, and so forth. So that's why you have this odd fixation with Israel. And it's become, among at least the more conservative evangelicals, a situation of Israel right or wrong sort of mentality. And you saw that during the Trump administration with the moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, for example, which was kind of on the wish list of these premillennial evangelicals. I can get more into the weeds in that if you want, but that's the general explanation. Come on, this side's got a, come on. All right, we got a couple folks.
I feel sort of bad asking a question because I've been talking to you all day long, but you mentioned, and I'm not going to get the name right, I think, but Criswell, the Southern Baptist leader, and that just in a 5-year period, he had changed very radically. And I'm just curious, we can think cynically about that as it being kind of he's got his finger to the political winds and sees this as politically advantageous, or is there something else going on? I guess I'm interested in, do you understand why he changed his mind so radically?
Yeah, well, I think his initial statement about the separation of church and state being sacrosanct or something to that effect, that occurred in 1960, and guess who was running for president in 1960? A Roman Catholic Democratic nominee for president. So I think that's probably the backstory, maybe all you need to know about that. But I think it is nevertheless significant that he would make a statement like that in 1960, and then in 1984, utterly reverse himself, saying the separation of church and state was the figment of some infidel's imagination. Now, again, by that point, the religious right had pretty much taken over the Republican Party, and so, for him, it was kind of full steam ahead, and let's not worry about this any longer. I think that's the backstory. But, nevertheless, I think the intervening moment was the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1979. And so 5 years later, as you said, he just was prepared to throw it out the window.
He was so much part of that.
Yeah, I mean, Roger Williams is the founder of the Baptist tradition in America. I mean, he's the one who came up with this metaphor, the wall of separation. And that has been, until 1979, that was part of the DNA of Baptists, particularly Southern Baptists. We believe in liberty of conscience, soul and liberty. I mean, that was just, any Baptist would just kind of, those phrases would just roll off his or her tongue. And after 1979, they cast their lot with the religious right, or they are the religious right. All right, we need somebody else over here. Yes.
So at the end of your prepared remarks, you offered 2 or 3 thoughts about what you thought could happen that might address some of the concerns about Christian nationalism. And in those remarks, I think I detected a faint hint of hope that those things would happen. Can you do anything to cultivate that hope for me so that I leave here feeling better than I do at this moment?
I'll try. Actually, for Easter Sunday, I wrote a piece in the Los Angeles Times about hope, because Easter is about hope, for those of us who are Christians. And I was musing on the fact that St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, talks about what had come to be known as the 3 theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. In 1 Corinthians 13, faith, hope, and love. And this is what theologians call theological virtues. And it occurred to me as I was thinking about it that, first of all, hope is the virtue that is least talked about. Faith, hope, and love. We talk about faith quite a bit. We talk about love, everything from philosophical treatises to treacly rom-coms or whatever it might be. But we don't talk much about hope. It also occurred to me that of the 3 theological virtues, hope is the only virtue that is volitional. That is, you can choose to be hopeful. You can't choose to fall in love, at least most of us can't. Especially if you're a Calvinist, you can't choose faith, right? But hope is the one virtue that you can choose. And it seems to me that hope these days, especially given the context of your question, and I quite agree with your general sense, that hope these days is a gesture of defiance. People talk about hoping against hope, and that's where I am these days. The other thing is that I believe that anyone who is a parent doesn't have the luxury of despair, because we have to do something for those who follow us. And so, yes, I am hopeful. Most days. I try to be hopeful. I try to cultivate that. And in part because I don't think despair gets you anywhere. I mean, it leads to a sense of defeatism. Now, are there concrete reasons to be hopeful at this time? Ask me that in mid-November, I suppose. Because this is a crucial moment. We've had this great American experiment, and I mean that with all the patriotism in my heart, that has endured for over 2 centuries. And I think it's in real peril. I think my purpose here is not to be political, but I guess I am verging in that direction. I think that the only thing that saved us, at least minimally in the first Trump administration, was incompetence. And if you read the news, notice I said read the news, apparently the folks surrounding Mr. Trump have already produced a roadmap for what I would characterize as the destruction of democracy. I don't know how you can interpret that any other way. So, yeah, I'm worried, but I'm still hopeful.
I really wasn't planning to ask a question, but this has been something that Meredith and I have talked a lot about in the past few years, just everything going on around us. Having read the book Jesus and John Wayne and Shadow Network about the Council of National Policy, what are your thoughts on this sort of allegiance between Christian nationalism and just giant corporations and those leaders basically to create this version of supply side Jesus? It's like, this is the Jesus was this free market man, and this is what he stood for, and that's why we have to have all these free market principles, because that's what Jesus was all about.
Yeah, and that's certainly not my reading of the New Testament, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, I have to say. But the other thing, again, as a historian, part of what I've tried to do over the last several decades, and you can judge for yourself how successful I've been, has been to call evangelicals back to their better selves. And to say, look, this movement was not always in bed with right-wing operatives. And if you look back into the 19th century, particularly the antebellum period, evangelicals were very much active in social reform. And any objective analysis of their program, their platform, would place them clearly to the left of a contemporary political spectrum. That is to say, evangelicals were very much involved in prison reform. They were involved in various peace movements. I've even run across a reference, by the way, to an evangelical gun control movement in the antebellum period. Evangelicals were fierce advocates for common schools, or what we call public education today, because they saw that as a way to raise the level, the status of those on the lower rungs of society. But, and also, very importantly, women's equality. Evangelicals advocated even for voting rights for women, which in the 19th century was a fairly radical idea. But Charles Grandison Finney, without any measure, without any question, the most influential evangelical of the 19th century, Finney and others, but particularly Finney, roundly criticized free market capitalism as being anti-Christian. And he said, this is my characterization, but this is the gist of what he said. He said that the Christian businessman was an oxymoron because business or commerce elevated avarice over altruism, and therefore it was not biblical, not Christian. So you have that history, you have that legacy for evangelical social action, and it just gets tossed aside late in the 1970s with the emergence of the religious right. Now, I shouldn't say entirely, because we have people like Jim Wallace, who's on book tour right now with this latest book. Sojourners community is now with Georgetown University, but the founder of Sojourners, who would be very much in that tradition of so-called progressive evangelicalism. Jimmy Carter. I wrote a biography of Jimmy Carter and asked him about the term progressive evangelical. Would you consider yourself a progressive evangelical? He said, yes, absolutely. I would. But he claimed that term, but also more broadly that tradition. So there is that tradition. As I said, for the last couple of decades, I've been trying to call evangelicals back to that tradition, and you can see how successful I've been.
So if the separation of church and state has been what made the church so healthy in the United States, then when we lose that, does that not mean that the church is harmed? And I guess the question that I would ask more broadly is, do you think that Christian nationalism is a bigger threat to the nation or a bigger threat to Christianity? When all the dust settles, I think the state will be here, but maybe the church won't.
Yeah, it's just a good way to put it. I think there's a real danger there. Yeah. No, I think that's to me the great irony of all of this is that the First Amendment is the best friend that religion has ever had. And why folks would want to go destroy it is just incomprehensible to me. And now I'll give you a historical example. And if I haven't answered your question sufficiently, come back to me. The First Amendment, of course, did away with religious establishments, but at that time the states continued to have, many of the states continued to have a religious establishment. Massachusetts was the last to disestablish the Congregational Church in 1833, but before that was Connecticut in 1820. And in the run-up to that decision on the part of the legislature, whether or not to continue funding the Congregational Church in Connecticut, Lyman Beecher, Litchfield, Connecticut, was just apoplectic. This is going to be disaster. The faith will just disappear from our lives. Morals are going to go to hell. You can't imagine a bigger catastrophe if the Congregational Church is no longer the established church in Connecticut. Well, the legislature went ahead and disestablished the Congregational Church in 1820. Within 2 years, Lyman Beecher wrote, "This is the best thing that ever happened to religion." He said, all of a sudden, we're left on our own, we can do what we want to do, and there's a revival of religion that's taking place here in Connecticut because the state is no longer involved in religion. So that's one example, I think, of this sort of free marketplace. And by the way, in 1776, when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, which of course is a huge tome about free market capitalism, one of the examples he used was religion, saying that if the government gets out of the religion business, religion is going to flourish. And I think it was absolutely right about that. So I think it's a danger both ways. Would be my short answer.
Well, I'm going to interrupt and say that Randy would maybe talk to some of you one-on-one. That's with them. That you can talk to some people
Sure.
afterwards.
I might have to take more questions too if you want.
Oh, what do you have?
I mean, it's up to you. You're running the show here. I'm sorry.
Those are just some good, hopeful things to end on. I just want to remind my students, can y'all hear me? That there's a sign-up sheet out front. So those of you who are required to be here, make sure you're taking it. And I just think it's been a really great opportunity.